Welcome to Our Special Lives. Today we're talking about a blended or blenderized diet for children with a feeding tube and how to approach the question of what to feed your child. In my earlier video, we talked about the mechanics of blending food, but a more complicated topic is how to approach what goes in the blender. The short answer is there is no one-size-fits-all plan, and that's why I'm so excited to speak with my guest today, Dr. Suzanne Morris. Dr. Morris is a world-renowned PhD and has centered her career around treating pediatric feeding and pre-speech disorders. Suzanne literally wrote the book on pediatric feeding-related issues, co-authoring Pre-Feeding Skills, a comprehensive guide to mealtime development, as well as Homemade Blended Formula Handbook, among others. Suzanne is in private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia, and through her practice, New Visions, she provides clinical services to children with feeding disorders, as well as seminars and workshops for children, families, and other professionals in her field. We have had the privilege of working with Suzanne one-on-one with our son for many years, and I can't think of a better person to discuss forming a framework for approaching a blended or blenderized diet. Suzanne, I'm so thrilled to be talking with you today about this topic. I think a lot of parents of children with feeding tubes are interested or curious about blenderized diets, but the topic can seem quite overwhelming. So I'm hoping we can provide a path forward for those parents and give them ideas for what a blended diet can look like, considerations and approaches to this question, and how to form partnerships with therapists, doctors, and dietitians to find the right diet for their child. So Suzanne, why don't we begin with your book, Homemade Blended Formula Handbook, which is available on Amazon, and I'll link to it below. The book is so beautiful in that it's such a comprehensive approach to blenderized diets and feeding, and it has been invaluable for us. I think it could be incredibly helpful for people searching for resources on this topic. So can you talk for a few minutes about the book and your inspiration for writing it, and maybe give the audience an overview of your book?
Both Marcia Dunn Klein and I as a speech language pathologist and Marcia as an occupational therapist, both of us very experienced feeding therapists working with infants and children. We recognized from the families that we worked with and many families on listservs at that time that there was a tremendous need for sharing communication, sharing our experiences, and sharing the challenges and the ideas that came about with it. We decided that the book needed to be very parent-driven because that's where the need really was coming from. And parents need the input of all of the others on a team of dietitians, feeding therapists, parents, and physicians. That team comes together to really look at what's needed in a diet, but that the driving force and the questions needed to come from parents. And so what our first step in creating this book was to ask from the listservs any parents who would like to give us input. We had 25 parents who responded. These were all parents who were currently doing a blended formula on their own. Some of them had support from a dietitian. Many of them did not, because the dietitians were not at that time very interested. The theme of feeding kids was almost strictly a canned or commercial formula. And the idea of a food-based formula felt unusual. It felt scary, I think, to a lot of people. So we asked many questions on a questionnaire to these parents. But the key one was, if you were to be starting a formula like this with your kid, what's the one thing you would want to find in a book like this? What's the one most important aspect? Well, of course, it was different for different parents because we're all different, but it gave us the start for this book. And then, because Marcia and I believe very strongly that all of this is about partnerships, And how do we find the partnership? How do we create the partnership? We wanted the book to represent this. So the book includes short articles that Marcia and I have written as feeding therapists. It includes the input from 2 dietitians, from a physician, and from 3 or 4 parents whose children are all quite different. So it gave a very good portrait, in a sense, of the issues. It includes the many different aspects in terms of content, from the physical aspects of creating a blended formula, what goes into it, what blends well together, what kinds of suggestions and tips coming from parents make it easier, things they learned the hard way out of their own experience. It includes some wonderful discussions from the 2 dietitians about the nutrients and the calories and the need for water, for hydration, all of the physical kinds of things that we need to think about when we do tube feedings. But it all, and with a lot of charts, a lot of things on the basis of, well, the food pyramid was in was what our government input was at that point. It then went to the plate system, and so our second edition is feeding plates. But it can give a good general idea. It includes lists of, in the appendix, of different vitamins, minerals, and the lists of foods that have a lot of it in it. So there are these very practical kinds of things. It does not include do this diet, do that diet, do another, because kids are all different. And we didn't want to encourage families to start out with a tube feeding blend for a 2-year-old when they had an 8-year-old, or a child who needed more of certain nutrients in their diet or was allergic to certain things. And, here the book says, do this, this, and this. This is definitely something we avoided. But then the book also gets into the, how do we go about it? What is it? Well, how do we make this a mealtime? This is a child's meal. It's not just a feeding. It's breakfast, it's lunch, it's dinner. I remember getting a video from a company that made feeding pumps. And I was absolutely astounded to listen to how they talked about feeding a child, because they talked about giving the child a dose of formula. And I went, a dose? That's medicine. A dose. I don't have a dose of breakfast, a dose of dinner.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is something that parents really need to embrace is that even though your child has a feeding tube, feeding them and them eating is still a human experience, not necessarily a medical procedure. And when you get a feeding tube, I'm not sure why, but I feel like most doctors and sort of the medical establishment turn that act of a human experience into a medical procedure. And we kind of need to figure out a way to take that back in a way so that we think about, in all of this, that we are giving our child a human experience. And what do we want that to look like?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this book is built around a mealtime concept, that all of us have meals, and mealtimes are sharing. I think one of the things, that I still see is that comes from a more medicalized perspective is you hook the kid up to the tube, especially if they're on a pump, and then you can go off and do whatever you need to do while your kid is fed. Well, that's not a meal. I mean, yes, a lot of us eat by ourselves, but if you have, you have a mom, you have a dad, you have a brother or a sister. A mealtime can be two people just sitting down and sharing being together. And that's what this is about. So many of the chapters in the books are about communication at mealtimes. They're about how you set up a mealtime. How do you make mealtimes relaxed instead of uncomfortable? How does a parent read a child's very subtle nonverbal cues that say, I'm getting uncomfortable? Very often parents recognize when their child's uncomfortable, but it's when the child is going like this, but very often we'll see a child who's first recognizing that their tummy doesn't feel good. They'll pull on an ear, or they'll kind of make a funny face. Or I've got one kid who would do this, and if he would do this for long enough and you ignored it, then all of a sudden he was vomiting. And we don't have to wait for the vomiting. We don't have to wait for kids to be really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I mean, anytime that I'm giving input to people who are feeding Finn, the first thing I say is watch his face,
Yes.
because he has certain, just like you're saying, certain facial expressions that I know he's getting sick. His demeanor changes. He goes from being very happy to maybe being very quiet. The corners of his mouth start to turn down. He may start salivating more than baseline. And so I agree. It's a very medicalized approach to say, I'm going to hook you up to the pump, or I'm going to jam this food in your feeding tube, and that's going to be it. There's a lot more to it. And I would love to do a second video with you on considerations for how to feed, because I think that's one thing that's discussed in the homemade blended formula book that is so helpful, and I feel like often just kind of overlooked, because parents go into this feeding with such a medicalized, get it done, check it off the box kind of approach, and I think that's unfortunate, because children do get uncomfortable. Particularly, a lot of the kids who get feeding tubes have had the Nissen, and that decreases the stomach volume or causes issues with motility sometimes. And I don't think doctors and practitioners sort of tell you enough or beat the table enough that can really cause some uncomfortable or discomfort issues with feeding.
I'd love to do that with you, Laura.
Yeah.
And the other thing that this reminds me of is that when we don't have a partnership, what happens is that every professional does the very best they know how, based on their experience, their knowledge, and their beliefs. And sometimes we can get very, very narrow in the way we look at things. Let me give you one example that relates to the kinds of food we might put in. We have children the speed of emptying of their stomach is very slow for a wide variety of reasons. Many of these children also may end up with constipation. They get full. They get full from the bottom up. We get full from the top down. Okay. But what many dietitians will say, or at least some will say, okay, calories, we have the greatest amount of calories in fat. So we need to add more oil. We need to add more fats to this formula. If they are not thinking about the medical gastrointestinal connection, they don't think about the fact that fats stay in the stomach longer. They make digestion slower. So if a child already has a delayed gastric emptying, they're going to have even more problems if we load on the fats. The therapist needs to understand that as well, because we're usually the ones who see a family and a child more frequently. Dietitians don't see a family, every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, even once a month. They may see that child or talk to the parent intermittently. We're the ones who see those faces along with the parents. We're the one who then can say to a parent, you need to talk to the dietitian about this, or to ask the the pediatrician about his or her recommendations for the kinds of food that will be more supportive of a delay in gastric emptying, or to deal with constipation.
Hmm.
So this is why we need that partnership.
Well, that kind of
People
gets to, I
talking to
guess,
each other.
one question, as a parent, if you were the parent of a child who was being tube fed, how do you approach the idea of what kinds of foods to combine? You just mentioned fat and kind of understanding your child's particular needs and experimenting around with different fats to maybe see if the motility is affected better or worse with certain fats. Um, but how else do you approach kind of what foods to combine in the blender?
Well, I think the first step is asking your child's body what foods are going to work. And if you're putting a whole bunch in as a full blend and the child is uncomfortable, you have absolutely no idea what's contributing to that. So the first step to me is to look, probably even just starting with, an organic commercial baby food, where you can take, a teaspoon of peaches and mix that in with the formula that your child is getting, or mix it in as a separate snack of, peaches with a little bit of water added to it, not a lot. And you're going to watch the child. This is exactly what parents do when they are starting a baby on food. And the usual recommendation is to do that for a 4-day period of time, to notice not just what's happening as you give it, but a little bit over time, what the child's response is. If the child's response is fine, then you check off, peaches are great. Or they're fine by themselves. Then you may go on to another fruit and do that. This is going to take a little time, and you have to be patient. A lot of the tendency that we have as moms, particularly, and also as therapists, is to say, oh, let's just go with it, fast. And for some kids, yeah, it'll work fine. But I've always been one of being a really good observer and of going slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So I would maybe look for 4 or 5 different fruits, 4 or 5 different vegetables, 4 or 5 different grains, 4 or 5, some different protein sources. The grains, we're all familiar with the ideas of fruits and vegetables, but the, grains can be, it can be oats, it can be barley, it can be rice. Again, if you look in the commercial baby food sections, uh, you've got a lot of choices, and you can you know do this from the food that you make for the rest of your family. You blenderize some of the oatmeal that you had for breakfast, and try that out. The reason for doing 4 or 5 different ones as a start is that we want diversity. We want variation. There are very few of us who sit down and eat the same thing for every meal. And there's a reason for this. Our bodies are not designed to get everything they need in terms of the different nutrients, all the way from uh, the protein, the carbohydrates or starches, the fats, the three major groupings. We can't get all of that from a single food. And it goes even further if we're talking about what are called micronutrients, which are, we're familiar with them as the vitamins and the minerals, and then other kinds of things like that are called like phytonutrients and glyconutrients, etc. There are many, many, many different ones. And so the human body, the human being, going all the way back to the early prehistory time, was a hunter-gatherer. And they were wandering through the fields and the woods and eating eating berries, eating the grains as they came along, feasting occasionally on protein from a killed animal, etc. And so we were designed for diversity. And that's, to me, is absolutely key, that we don't want, when we start thinking about a formula, I like to think about at least 4 or 5 different formula combination meals. And I can do this if I have determined individually that for each of the major components that I have a choice of, 4 different vegetables. I have a choice of 4 or 5 different fruits, etc. I can mix and match that in a way that will be very helpful. So that's the way I go about it. And then I think the next step is to see if you can find a good pediatric dietitian who can be on your team, who ideally has some experience with blended formulas, but most importantly is open to your wanting to do that, open to the possibility, respectful of the fact that you have checked out this list of foods. That makes it so much easier for a dietitian. And there, unfortunately, are many dietitians who still are not open to this possibility. It was a rare dietitian when Marcia and I published the book, very rare to find someone who'd had experience. But the book began to intrigue people, and it was parents who brought it to their doctors. It was parents who brought it to a dietitian and said, my child is better. My child's not vomiting anymore. My child's gaining weight. My child's skin isn't flaky. The only thing I've done differently is change the diet. And this got doctors and it got dietitians looking at these things and being at least willing to work with parents. The one suggestion that we've made from the beginning is if a parent is really determined that this is what he or she wants to do, then it becomes figuring out from the material in the book, websites online. There now are some wonderful, wonderful websites and groups that are devoted entirely to blenderized feedings. And you can get a ton of ideas from parents from that kind of a resource. But from that, coming up with a couple of formulas that you start to feed your child. Then what you do is you make an appointment with a pediatric dietitian who you like. You can talk to other parents. Who do you know who's in Charlottesville, Virginia, or in Richmond, or in New York City? Who are dietitians you've had bad experiences with? To sort of, it's like interviewing somebody for a job. That's what you're doing.
And I think one thing to look for in finding the right dietitian is the dietitian who has the philosophy that children and people in general, children with feeding tubes and children without, people get their nutrition over periods of time. You're not getting everything every day of the year. You're getting, things seasonally. You're getting things over the span of a week or two. And having that sort of bigger picture philosophy actually makes the blending process easier, because you can work within a framework of food that's available to you, and you don't have to worry about putting 20 things in the blender every day, as long as you're rotating through a framework that's been kind of recommended and kind of predetermined by this partnership with this dietitian who kind of has the same philosophy
Mhm.
as you.
But you also can walk that mile of listening to what the dietitian has to offer. And there are two of the things that come to my mind. One is that the majority of kids that dietitians are working with are typical kids who eat by mouth. Now, they're not going to be saying, okay, you got to have all 20 of these things in breakfast or in lunch. They don't do that. They get into a habit of thinking that it all has to be in one, because that's what the pharmaceutical companies, listening to the recommended daily allowances, says needs to be in a formula. Okay. And so what you can do is say, look, I'm really committed to this as a mom. What I need your help with, dietitian, is I need you to look at the blends that I'm creating. Give me feedback based on your knowledge, based on your wonderful skills in knowing the nutrients that a child can benefit from. All of these dietitians do not do this just by hand. They're all done through computerized programs, and they have the ability with these programs to um, run it through, to look at what nutrients are maybe too much or too little, et cetera, et cetera. The dietitian may be able to say to you, okay, you've got carrots on this list. Carrots are great. If you add, if instead of giving carrots tomorrow, you did the blend with sweet potatoes, or you did it with spinach, your kid is going to be getting this nutrient, which over a week's period of time seems to be missing. First of all, when dietitians look at any diet, they're not looking at it by the day. They're looking at a 7-day intake. Okay? So that's what they're looking at. And I think it allows you to go in without a defensive posture. It goes in of saying, this is a decision I've made. My kid's different. I've been exploring it a little bit. I have used the formula that you've recommended as my liquid base, because one of the things that's really different about getting nutrients into a child who is tube fed is it has to be liquefied. Well, you sit down, you take the meal that your other kids might have, and it fits their tummy. And, let's say you've got a twin, and one kid is eating a meal by mouth, the other is on a tube. Now, they're not going to be the same, even if they're identical twins. But, you say, okay, this is this is the amount of food my, son A, who eats by mouth, eats. And so what I'll just do is take that same amount of food, add some liquid to it and give it to my other son through the tube. Well, guess what? You might have a volume that's 50% more. So there's a very fine line where looking at what liquids can thin it down, can also give more hydration with it. And can we rotate that? Sometime it might be the formula. Another time it might be a vegetable broth that you've made, or bone broth, or almond milk, or something of this sort. So this is where a dietitian, can use the skills that he or she has to look at the foods you're giving and say, what if we added this? I'm not saying add this to one meal, but to your meals over the week. And then maybe you say to, let's say it's a female dietitian, and you say to her, I really want to give my child foods that don't have a lot of chemicals in it, foods that don't have a lot of additives in it. And what I know is that I love my local farmers market, but they don't have carrots every month, They don't at the grocery store. Now it's getting easier to get organic food, for example, in a wide variety. But could we look at formulas that maybe have more winter foods in them? And so that might be a formula that would have some of the winter squashes, maybe butternut squash, maybe spaghetti squash in it. Whereas a summer formula might have zucchini or might have yellow squash if we wanted to go with a squash. This is how ideally we feed ourselves, how we feed our other kids. So it becomes, I think, I like to, in talking with a dietitian, talk about how can we work together? How can we put our heads together? This is what's important to me as a parent, and this is what's possible for me as a parent. So it's like looking at what's possible for a particular family. If a family is more limited, one of the other things that we get into is that up until recently, insurance companies have been willing to pay for commercial formulas. They will not pay for anything going into a homemade blended formula. Well, if money's tight in your family and the insurance company will pay for the meals for this kid, you're going to go with a commercial formula. Now, one of the absolute blessings that again started out as parent driven is that because many families want blended formulas, because many families want the convenience of a blended formula when they travel or when their child's in the hospital, we now have several companies that are making good quality blended formulas out of real food. And they are commercially available, and some insurance companies are paying for them. So times are changing. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, we actually have a kind of backup for Finn. It's called Real Food Blends.
Yeah.
And I really like it. I think it's if you typically blend food and for us we use it in the case where we're traveling, or if for example, with this coronavirus, certain foods that we normally need to do the blend haven't been as readily available. So that's great. I mean, the pros are it's all real food. It is, formulated with the RDA in mind by a team of nutritionists and specialists. And so it is going to give your child the caloric needs and, the nutritional needs that they need. But just as an example with what we do, Finn gets a wide variety every day of fruits and different vegetables and leafy greens and rotation of fats and proteins. And so I think when you do the type of blended diet that we've been talking about, you do get a broader span of different foods, a different micronutrient profile, a different lipid profile, different amino acid profile. So it is a little bit kind of more robust on that. But I agree that the real food blends are an amazing option if it is not feasible to do a blended diet. The other thing I wanted to comment on what you said is that some people think that the blended diet needs to be an all or nothing proposition. And I just want to point out that that's not true. You can continue to do a formula based meal, a couple times a day, and maybe do dinner with blended food, or do blended food snacks with, kind of your typical formula. So there's a lot of ways that you can play with it. And then the last thing I wanted to add is that when you're working to find foods that your child tolerates or doesn't tolerate, like for example, Finn doesn't tolerate beans at all. So any sort of pea or that kind of thing, doesn't tolerate it at all, doesn't tolerate avocado, doesn't tolerate pears. So we learned this information by the process of trial and error. And once you work with the dietitian, as you suggested, to get some kind of combinations and permutations of a blended framework that you can kind of give your child over the course of a week or a couple weeks, it gets easier. So it seems kind of overwhelming to any parent that might be listening as we're talking, that there's so much of this trial and error and creating these frameworks and all of that. And that is true at the beginning, but after a while you become so used to working in these frameworks and with the kind of variety of foods that are on the menu that it really does become something that's very manageable in your daily life. So I just wanted to point that out for listeners who might be thinking, wow, this sounds like a lot.
Yeah. The other thing is, many parents and therapists, find ways of making it easier. If I'm fixing one of these, say, vegetables for my family's dinner, I make 4 or 5 extra servings. So I don't have to cook everything all at once on a weekend. Some families will make a specific packet. This is breakfast, and this is lunch, and this is dinner. Other families say, look, this is the meal for the day. And so, yeah, it's going to be the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it's going to be very different tomorrow. And this is where family choices come in. I think I told you the story, Laura, of the mom who very excitedly called me after she started blending food for her child. And she was so excited because they had gone to McDonald's. She had, I think, 3 other kids, and they had bought a kid's Happy Meal for her son who was on a feeding tube. And she took it home, and the kids all sat around the table eating their Happy Meal. She put the Happy Meal into the blender for her son who was tube fed, and he got his Happy Meal too. There was a part of me initially as a therapist that went, oh my gosh, I can't imagine, from a nutritional standpoint, um, wanting to blenderized fast food restaurant stuff, whether it's McDonald's or Wendy's or, whoever. But I had the common sense to ask her, what did that mean to you? And she said, why are you? I said, you are so excited. What does this mean? And she said, my son is now a regular kid. He's just like the other kids. I've wanted that for so long. And I also remember another mother who provided our input to the book, who I'll never forgotten her comment. She said, once I started a homemade blended formula for my daughter, for the first time, I really felt like her mother and not like her can opener.
I love that. I mean, I think that's so true. Um, there's something so fundamental about feeding your child, and I think that's we've gotten so much satisfaction out of being able to provide the blended diet to Finn, and I totally relate to the story about McDonald's, because there have been many instances where, we've been able to make vanilla milkshakes for Finn's birthday, and we can all participate in that. It's not a cupcake, it's not a piece of cake, but we figured out a way that we can all share in the same food for his birthday. It just gives you a sense of, it's just what families do. It's kind of what having a birthday means, that you get to celebrate and have a treat and share that among your family members. And I remember we were so lucky in Finn's preschool one year when it was his birthday. We brought in stuff to make smoothies, and the kids got to throw everything in the blender, and then all the kids got, the fruit and the yogurt smoothie that we'd made, and Finn did as well. So he got to participate, with his class in his birthday party, which is, almost unheard of for a kid with a feeding tube. So I think that aspect, kind of going outside the box in this conversation and thinking about, what does it mean? What does it mean to be able to participate in meals that don't, necessarily fit the nutritional profile that we're looking for most of the time? But we don't need to do that all the time. We can use this kind of broad concept to bring our child in closer to the family and operate more within the norm of how we want to eat with our child.
In all of this, nutrition and hydration absolutely is at the top of every list for feeding and for eating. And for those of us as therapists, we absolutely must not compromise a child's nutrition or ability to get the fluids, especially water, etc., that's needed by our therapy techniques or whatever we're doing. But I think there also could be a very great advantage of using the common fruits, vegetables, oils, etc., that are easily available. That's one of the reasons I like to think about this in my partnership as a therapist, is that some of these kids do have some ability to take tastes. They have the ability to perhaps eat small amounts of food by mouth. They do not have the safety or the ability to take the quantity that's needed to nourish themselves completely through oral feeding. They may be children who are on feeding tubes because they really are rejecting a lot of change in oral, the foods that are served at an oral meal time. There's a tremendous opportunity in our tube feedings to create blends that taste good, to create blends that, a child can, a child, for example, could be involved with helping to make a formula. And, I think you've seen a video that I did of a little girl where, she's out in the kitchen with mom. She's a 3-year-old. She's out in the kitchen with mom. She's putting things in. She's putting corn in. And she takes some bites of corn and then she pours the cup of it in. And then her lunch includes the foods it includes the blend that she's made, but it includes very small amounts on her plate of the individual foods. So she is taking some snacks with this, and then she's taking a taste of the blend and helping mom put it, in the tube. It's wonderful. And there are many children who can do this. We take our orally feeding kids out to the kitchen. They help us, baking and putting things together. This is part of childhood. And so if we are doing this, it can make a big difference in that bridge into some happy and enjoying of food by mouth. I've worked with many, many kids who now are young adults who tell me that their favorite activity is going to restaurants. They love to go to restaurants and take small tastes and to have their blended formula while everybody else is having theirs. To me, this is what it's about. And then the other thing is that we are finding through research that our taste receptors are all throughout the whole gastrointestinal tract. We used to believe it was just on the little papilla, the little points on the tongue, and it was in the mouth and on the tongue for the taste receptors. We know that's not true. We know that there are taste receptors all the way down and into the stomach. And here's where we get a lot of great input from our kids who have had the fundoplication, or kids who have a tracheostomy where air's not going up that would give smell. And again, a little girl, I think this was a child who Marcia Dunn Klein had worked with, who kept saying to her mom, "Thank you for giving me apricots today in my blend." And the mom would look at her and go, "How do you know they're apricots?" "Well, I know apricots. I can taste them." Well, if you're getting an introduction to taste and smell for a child who has the ability to burp some of the air coming up from the belly from the tube feeding, you're introducing feeding experiences at a different level. And I think this is so important.
So I think what I'm kind of gathering from this in terms of considerations for a blended diet is not only do we want to look at kind of the nutrient profile of it, but also the importance of just the palatability of it, because this is what the child is experiencing in a very important category of their life, which is food.
Yeah.
And so maybe not do blends with so much, kale and liver and salmon oil, but maybe, not to never incorporate those things, but try to keep in mind that this is also a sensory experience for the child.
Absolutely. And then the other thing we have not talked about is using commercial baby foods. And it is not always possible for a parent to afford a really high-powered blender. It is not always possible for that to be, the convenience when they're going on vacation. One of the things that many, many parents don't realize about a lot of the commercial stage 2 baby, particularly the stage 2 baby foods, which are the thinner pureed kind of baby food, is that they are held to a higher standard of purity. And I'm not talking just about organic baby food, but the companies are held by, I guess it would be the FDA, to less pesticides, less pollutants, etc., in the fruits and vegetables and the grains that are made, that are they use to make in their prepared baby foods. I'm not a great fan of giving every kid prepared baby foods. I think where we can make our own is wonderful. It's wonderful for us and for our kids. But there are many families, even with older kids, who are able to do a blended formula because they access the commercial baby foods. It goes back to your comment, Laura, that to me is so important, and that is helping helping our professionals as well as our parents know that we are just giving kids a meal, that it is meals that's important, that it's food that's important, that this is not a medical procedure. For some children, it may be. There are children who have severe allergies. There are children who have metabolic problems, who it's not just, oh, I'm uncomfortable if I eat this, but if I eat this, I could be dying. And these are kids who need to have special formulas, either the canned version of it or very careful work with a dietitian to create the formulas that are safe and healthy and promote growth. Michael Pollan had 3 points that are very easy to remember as our guideline for, uh, for selecting our foods at our meals. The first is eat food. Second is not too much. And the third is mostly plants. And I think that if we can honor that as well when we are creating a meal for our kids, we're going to be in great shape, and so are they.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's basically, again, we've worked through a lot of these issues because we've been feeding Finn a blended diet for, 8 years, over 8 years. But that's kind of the way we feed him. We very carefully measure out the protein because I think protein is one thing that parents can often overestimate when they're doing a blended diet. But the vast majority by volume are plants, are leafy greens, are things that we might get from the farmer's market, are whatever vegetable happens to be in season, different fruits. So the vast majority by volume of what Finn eats are mostly plants, and that served him really well. I mean, he's got cerebral palsy. He's in the roughly about 35th percentile for weight and 75th for height, which is pretty incredible, Suzanne, for a child with CP. Those are pretty good numbers.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. The one other thing I'd like to just add in terms of the plants, the fruit and vegetable aspect, we have no idea of all of the nutrients that are in a given plant. We pull out, if we're looking at specifics, we can say, oh, there's vitamin A, there's, vitamin K, there is zinc, there's this or that. But plants are made up very strongly of what are called phytonutrients, which are the nutrients that we hear some about, of like sulforaphane in broccoli and the lycopenes in tomatoes, etc. But we know very small numbers of them. The food science, the research scientists have estimated that there are thousands of these. And we know that all these nutrients work together. They don't work as, oh, I have to have this amount of vitamin A and this amount of vitamin C. It's vitamin A and vitamin C working together. It is vitamin D working with some of these others. It is knowing that there's a lot we don't know. And so if we can build a formula based on food, based on fresh fruits and vegetables, or fresh fruits and vegetables that have been frozen, are just as nutritious, then we know that we're giving our kids the combinations that their bodies were designed to be able to utilize. And I think this is one of the biggest advantages of doing a homemade blended formula, because it gives us opportunities that simply are not there when we are doing it based on a medicalized, this amount of vitamin A, this amount of this or that.
Well, I love that, Suzanne. I'm conscious of our time, so I think that we should wrap up. But I'm looking forward to speaking with you again on kind of the issues around how to feed your child. And I can't thank you enough for your time today. It's been just absolutely fantastic to get your thoughts on this very broad topic. And I know you've given our audience some great things to think about as they're approaching this topic. So thank you again so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's been my pleasure to be here and
Oh, great.
to talk with the many people who are enjoying your website. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.